Marcus Kane's finger froze on the trigger, his weathered hands trembling as he stared down the rifle scope at the massive lion trapped in steel jaws. The weapon that had taken countless lives across 3 continents suddenly felt impossibly heavy. This wasn't just any lion, it was the one from Timothy's drawings. The African ranger beside him dropped to his knees, blood seeping through his khaki shirt as he shielded the wounded animal with his own body. "Please," Django whispered, his voice cracking, "don't make the same mistake twice." Behind them, 5 lionesses formed an impossible circle, their golden eyes fixed on Marcus with something that looked disturbingly like recognition, like forgiveness. The old veteran's chest tightened as 8-year-old Timothy's voice echoed in his memory. "Daddy, promise me you'll take care of my lion friends." Sarah Mitchell's camera captured every devastating second. The moment a broken father faced the creature that held his son's final secret. One bullet could end decades of guilt and sleepless nights. But what if Timothy's death wasn't what Marcus believed? What if everything he'd spent 3 years hunting was built on a lie that would destroy what remained of his shattered soul? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, Marcus Kane had been a different man, or perhaps the same man drowning in different circumstances. At 48, the Vietnam veteran carried more scars inside than the shrapnel marks that crisscrossed his weathered hands. His small house in rural Ohio felt like a tomb, filled with the ghosts of better days and the crushing weight of $340,000 in medical debt that followed him like a shadow. Every morning began the same way, a phone call to his 75-year-old mother, Mary, whose arthritic fingers struggled with the buttons on her old rotary phone. "Morning, Ma," he'd say, forcing lightness into his voice while staring at the stack of overdue bills. "How are you feeling today?" The conversations never lasted long. What was there to say about 2 broken people trying to hold each other up across the miles? The house still smelled like Linda's lavender soap 3 years after cancer had taken her, and Timothy's room remained exactly as it was the day they'd laid him to rest. 8 years old. The official report said traumatic injuries sustained during zoo incident, but Marcus had never been able to read past those words. Some truths were too heavy to bear, even for a man who'd carried wounded soldiers through Vietnamese jungles. "Freedom isn't free, but nobody wants to pay the price," he'd mutter to himself, echoing his father's words while cleaning his rifle. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd survived 3 tours overseas only to come home and lose everything that mattered. Meanwhile, 3,000 miles away in Boston, Dr. Sarah Mitchell was fighting her own battles against time and circumstance. At 42, she'd dedicated her life to everyone except herself, splitting her attention between caring for her autistic sister Emma and their mother's advancing Alzheimer's. Her apartment was a maze of medical equipment and research papers, the walls covered with photographs of African wildlife that represented dreams deferred and paths not taken. "I give everything to everyone except myself," she'd confided to her sister during one of Emma's rare lucid moments. The $2.5 million research grant that could change both their lives hung by a thread, dependent on footage and findings that seemed increasingly impossible to obtain from her sterile Boston laboratory. Across the Atlantic, in the vast expanses of the Serengeti, Django Mwangi began each day by touching the bone necklace his father had made from the remains of the lions they'd both sworn to protect. At 35, he carried the weight of 8 family members on his $200 monthly salary, while his daughter Amara's college acceptance letter gathered dust on his modest kitchen table. Unfunded dreams in a world where wildlife rangers were heroes in poverty. His father had died protecting these same lions from poachers 10 years ago, and Django wore the elder's bones not as decoration, but as a daily reminder of the price of principles. "My father died protecting lions," he would tell visitors to the park. "Today, lions protect me." He never imagined how prophetic those words would prove to be. The Serengeti dawn painted the sky in shades of amber and gold, but Simba felt only the cold bite of steel against his front leg. The magnificent lion, his mane bearing the distinctive M-shaped scar that marked him as the son of the legendary Mfalme, had led his pride to the watering hole as he had done countless times before. The trap had been invisible in the morning shadows, a sophisticated snare designed for rhinos, its jaws powerful enough to crush bone. Now, 6 hours later, the mechanism had already tightened twice according to its cruel programming, each adjustment sending fresh waves of agony through his powerful frame. The trap's designer had built it with calculated cruelty. Every 30 minutes, the steel jaws would contract another inch, ensuring that whatever creature stepped into its maw would suffer before dying. Around him, 5 lionesses formed a protective circle that defied every natural instinct. These weren't his mates, as most observers would assume, but his daughters, grown now but still bound to their father by ties stronger than territory or survival. Nala, the alpha female, paced restlessly, her golden eyes scanning the horizon for threats. Sarabi lay closest to Simba, occasionally licking his wounds with gentle precision. The 3 younger lionesses, Kiara, Vitani, and Zira, maintained their vigil with the patience of those who understood that love sometimes meant witnessing pain without the power to stop it. 300 miles away, Marcus Kane jolted awake in his Nairobi hotel room, drenched in sweat and surrounded by empty beer bottles. The nightmare had been the same one that haunted him for 3 years. Timothy's small hand reaching for him while a lion's roar echoed in the background. But this time, something was different. This time, the lion in his dream had been trying to protect his son, not harm him. His phone buzzed with a text from his contact, a corrupt park official who fed him information about valuable targets. "Big male near Sector 7. Prime specimen. Move fast." Marcus stared at the message, his hands trembling not from withdrawal but from something deeper, a growing certainty that his war against these creatures was really a war against himself. But with his mother's medical bills mounting and the house in foreclosure, he couldn't afford philosophical questions. He needed that $50,000 a successful kill would bring. In her cramped research station, Dr. Sarah Mitchell packed her equipment with mechanical precision, each movement betraying the turmoil beneath her composed exterior. Her sister Emma had called 17 times since midnight, each message more desperate than the last. "If you don't come home, I'll join Timothy," the final voicemail had whispered, referencing the stranger's child whose story had somehow become part of Emma's fractured understanding of the world. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah that she'd spent 6 months studying animal behavior while completely missing the signs of her own sister's deteriorating mental state. Her research grant application sat on her laptop, 90% complete but missing the crucial footage that would prove her theories about lion social structures. Without it, she'd lose everything: the funding, her position, her ability to care for Emma and their mother. She grabbed her camera equipment and headed toward Sector 7, where her GPS had been tracking an unusual lion pride for weeks. Something about their behavior patterns intrigued her. The way they moved as a coordinated unit, almost like they were protecting something precious. Django Mwangi felt the bone necklace grow warm against his chest as he drove his battered jeep across the morning landscape. His father had always claimed the bones could sense when lions were in distress, but Django had dismissed it as superstition until today. The warmth was accompanied by an inexplicable urgency that pulled him toward the northeastern sector of the park. His radio crackled with routine morning reports, but underneath the static, he caught fragments of something else. The low, mournful sound that lionesses made when one of their pride was dying. He pressed harder on the accelerator, dust clouds billowing behind him as he raced toward coordinates he couldn't explain. When he crested the hill overlooking the watering hole, the scene below stopped him cold. A massive male lion lay trapped in what appeared to be a rhino snare, while 5 lionesses maintained a protective formation around him. But it was the lion's scar that made Django's breath catch, the distinctive M shape that marked him as Mfalme's son, the king's heir. As he reached for his radio to call for backup, movement on the opposite ridge caught his attention. A white woman with camera equipment was setting up to film the scene, while from the south, a dust cloud indicated another vehicle approaching fast. Django's blood chilled as he recognized the aggressive driving pattern. Poachers moved with that same desperate urgency. The bone necklace burned against his skin now, and his father's voice seemed to whisper in the wind. "Some cages are meant to be broken, son. But breaking them might break you too." Django's jeep skidded to a halt 50 yards from the trapped lion, kicking up a cloud of red dust that hung in the still morning air like a warning. Through his windshield, he could see the magnificent creature's labored breathing, the way his golden coat had darkened with sweat and blood where the steel jaws bit into flesh and bone. The 5 lionesses turned their heads toward him in unison, but instead of the aggressive posturing he expected, they simply watched with an intelligence that made his skin crawl. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, recognizing the sophisticated design of the trap. This wasn't the crude wire snare of desperate poachers. This was military-grade equipment, the kind used by professional hunters who sold to private collectors willing to pay premium prices for specific trophies. The trap's serial numbers had been filed off, but Django had seen enough of these devices to know they cost more than his annual salary. His radio buzzed with static, then cleared to reveal Sarah Mitchell's voice. "This is Dr. Mitchell, Research Station 7. I'm observing unusual lion behavior near the northeastern water source, requesting immediate assistance." Her academic tone couldn't quite mask the underlying panic, and Django could see her white Land Rover positioned on the opposite hill, telephoto lens glinting in the sunlight. "Dr. Mitchell, this is Ranger Mwangi. Do not approach the animals. I repeat, do not approach. We have a dangerous situation here." Django grabbed his tranquilizer rifle and medical kit, his mind racing through protocols that seemed inadequate for what lay before him. The trap would continue tightening every 30 minutes. He'd seen the timer mechanism before, a cruel innovation that ensured maximum suffering. As he stepped from his vehicle, the bone necklace his father had made seemed to pulse with warmth against his chest. The sensation was so intense he pressed his hand to it, remembering his father's final words. "The lions know their friends, son. They remember kindness, and they remember those who would harm them." At the time, Django had thought it was delirium talking. Now, faced with 5 predators who should have fled at human approach, he wondered if his father had known something science couldn't explain. The alpha lioness, easily 300 pounds of muscle and claw, took a step toward him. Django froze, his finger finding the tranquilizer gun's safety. But instead of aggression, her posture conveyed something else entirely. Her head was lowered, not in attack position, but in what almost looked like supplication. Behind her, the other 4 lionesses had arranged themselves in a perfect star formation around their trapped patriarch, a configuration Django had never seen in 20 years of wildlife observation. "What the hell are you doing?" Sarah's voice carried across the distance as she abandoned her equipment and began jogging down the hillside. "Those are wild lions. You can't just walk up to them." But Django was already moving, driven by an instinct deeper than training or protocol. The trapped lion's breathing had become increasingly labored, and fresh blood darkened the ground beneath the steel jaws. Time was running out, and every minute of hesitation brought them closer to a point of no return. As he approached, the lionesses parted like curtains, creating a pathway directly to their suffering leader. The behavior was so unprecedented that Django felt his worldview shifting with each step. These animals were thinking, planning, communicating in ways that transcended what he'd been taught about predator behavior. The trapped lion, Simba, as Django had begun thinking of him, lifted his massive head and fixed golden eyes on the approaching human. There was pain there, certainly, but also something that looked disturbingly like recognition, like trust. Django had never believed the old stories about lions who remembered human kindness, but the expression in those amber depths made him reconsider everything he thought he knew about the boundary between animal and human consciousness. His radio crackled again, this time with a different voice. "This is Kane. I'm 5 minutes out from Sector 7 coordinates. Anyone in the area needs to clear out now." The transmission was brief, professional, but Django caught the underlying tension. He'd heard that name whispered among the local guides. Marcus Kane, the American who paid top dollar for specific lions, who hunted with the precision of a soldier and the desperation of a man with nothing left to lose. "Dr. Mitchell," Django spoke into his radio while continuing his approach to the trapped lion, "we have a problem. There's a hunter en route, and if we don't get this animal free in the next few minutes, we're going to have a lot more than a rescue situation on our hands." The lionesses seemed to sense the increased urgency. Nala, the alpha female, moved to Django's side, not threatening but protective, as if she understood that his intentions aligned with theirs. Her proximity was both terrifying and oddly comforting. This close he could hear her breathing, could smell the wild musk of her coat, could feel the barely contained power in her frame. Sarah reached them just as Django knelt beside the trap, his hands already working to understand the mechanism. "This is insane," she panted, her camera hanging forgotten around her neck. "These animals should have killed you by now. Lions don't behave like this. They don't just accept human intervention." "Maybe they do when they need to," Django replied, his fingers tracing the steel jaws that held Simba captive. The mechanism was even more sophisticated up close, a masterpiece of engineering designed for maximum cruelty. "My father used to say that desperate times make strange allies." In the distance, the sound of an approaching engine grew louder, accompanied by the distinctive whine of aggressive driving. Marcus Kane was coming, and with him, a confrontation that would test every assumption about the relationship between predator and prey, hunter and protector, guilt and redemption. The bone necklace burned against Django's chest as if his father's spirit was trying to warn him. Some rescues came with a price that extended far beyond the immediate moment, and some traps were designed to catch more than just animals. The sound of Marcus Kane's approaching vehicle cut through the morning air like a death knell, its engine pushed beyond reasonable limits as dust clouds billowed in his wake. Django's hands worked frantically at the trap mechanism, sweat beading on his forehead as he traced the intricate steel components that held Simba captive. The lionesses maintained their protective formation, but their ears had swiveled toward the approaching threat, low growls rumbling in their throats like distant thunder. "How much time do we have?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with tension as she knelt beside Django, her researcher's mind cataloging the unprecedented behavior unfolding before her. The alpha lioness, Nala, had positioned herself directly between them and the direction of Marcus's approach, while the other 4 daughters maintained their vigil around their father with military precision. "Based on his driving speed, maybe 3 minutes," Django replied, his fingers finding a release mechanism hidden beneath the trap's base. "But this thing is designed to require 2 people to operate. It's a safety feature to prevent accidents, but right now it's going to get us all killed." The trap had already contracted twice since Simba's capture, and the next adjustment would likely crush the bone completely. The lion's breathing had become increasingly shallow, his massive frame trembling with shock and blood loss. Yet his golden eyes remained fixed on Django with an expression that seemed almost human in its complexity. Pain, certainly, but also something that looked remarkably like hope. Sarah's phone buzzed with an incoming call from Boston. The display showed Emma's number, and for a moment she hesitated, torn between her sister's crisis and the life-or-death situation unfolding before her. The call went to voicemail, followed immediately by a text. "They're taking me to the hospital. I can't do this anymore. I love you." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, but before she could respond, Marcus Kane's vehicle crested the hill. The battered Land Cruiser came to an abrupt halt 30 yards away, and the man who emerged looked nothing like the professional hunter Sarah had expected. Marcus Kane was lean to the point of gauntness, his weathered face bearing the particular kind of exhaustion that came from years of inadequate sleep and too much alcohol. His rifle was expensive and well-maintained, but his hands shook slightly as he raised it toward the group around the trapped lion. "Step away from the animal," Marcus called out, his voice carrying the flat authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "This is private business, and you're interfering with a legitimate hunt." "Legitimate?" Django's voice cracked with anger as he continued working on the trap. "There's nothing legitimate about torturing an animal with a snare. This is poaching, pure and simple." Marcus kept the rifle trained on the group, but something in his posture suggested reluctance rather than aggression. "You don't understand the situation here. That lion is dangerous. It's killed before, and it'll kill again if you set it free." Sarah looked up from her position beside Simba, her maternal instincts overriding her academic objectivity. "Look at them," she said, gesturing to the 5 lionesses who remained in their protective formation despite the presence of an armed human. "Does this look like the behavior of aggressive animals? They're protecting him, the same way any family would protect their father." The word father seemed to hit Marcus like a physical blow. He lowered the rifle slightly, his weathered features contorting with pain that had nothing to do with the physical world. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Families don't. They can't always protect each other. Sometimes the thing you're trying to save ends up destroying you anyway." Django managed to release the first part of the trap mechanism, but the steel jaws remained locked around Simba's leg. The lion let out a low groan of pain that seemed to echo across the savannah. And in response, his daughters moved closer, their massive heads brushing against his mane in gestures of comfort that transcended species boundaries. "I know about families," Marcus continued, his rifle wavering as memories threatened to overwhelm him. "I know about watching someone you love suffer and not being able to do a damn thing about it. I know about making promises you can't keep and living with the consequences every single day." Sarah's phone buzzed again, this time with a call from the hospital. She answered quickly, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is Dr. Mitchell." The conversation was brief, but when she hung up, tears were streaming down her face. "My sister tried to kill herself," she said to no one in particular. "She's in the ICU, and I'm 8,000 miles away playing with lions." The revelation seemed to break something in Marcus. He lowered his rifle completely, his shoulders sagging under the weight of recognition. "How old is your sister?" he asked quietly. 35, Sarah replied, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "She has autism. She depends on me, and I left her alone because I thought this research was more important. I thought I could save the world's lions while my own family fell apart." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring at the scene before him with new eyes. Simba's daughters continued their vigil, their devotion absolute despite the presence of an armed threat. It was a kind of loyalty he'd once believed in, a kind of love he'd thought was extinct in a world that seemed designed to destroy anything beautiful or pure. "My son was 8, Marcus said finally, his voice barely audible. "Timothy. He died 3 years ago, and I've been blaming lions ever since." He paused, his hands now openly trembling. "But the truth is, it wasn't really a lion that killed him. It was me. My anger, my drinking, my inability to come back from the war in one piece. He died because I failed him. And I've been hunting these animals ever since because it's easier than hunting the real monster." Django had managed to loosen the trap's grip significantly, but Simba remained caught. The mechanism required simultaneous pressure on 2 release points positioned several feet apart, an impossible task for one person. "I need help," he said, looking between Marcus and Sarah. "We can free him, but it has to be all of us working together." The alpha lioness, Nala, seemed to understand the dynamics at play. She approached Marcus slowly, her massive paws silent on the dusty ground. Instead of aggression, her posture conveyed something that looked remarkably like supplication. She stopped just out of arm's reach and lay down, exposing her throat in the ultimate gesture of trust. "She's asking you to help," Sarah said softly, her scientific mind struggling to process what she was witnessing. "I've never seen behavior like this. It's as if they understand not just what we're trying to do, but why we're trying to do it." Marcus stared at the lioness for a long moment, then at the trapped lion whose golden eyes remained fixed on him with unwavering intensity. "Timothy loved lions," he said quietly. "He had drawings of them all over his room. Used to say they were the bravest animals in the world because they protected their families no matter what." The sound of the trap's timer mechanism clicking warned them that another contraction was imminent. They had perhaps 30 seconds before the steel jaws would tighten again, possibly crushing Simba's leg beyond repair. Marcus made his decision. He set his rifle aside and moved to the opposite release point from Django. "Tell me what to do," he said, his hands finding the metal mechanism. "Tell me how to save him." Sarah positioned herself near Simba's head, her hands gentle on his massive mane as she spoke in the soothing tones she'd once used with her sister during Emma's worst episodes. "It's going to be okay," she whispered. "We're going to get you out of this. Just hold on a little longer." The 5 lionesses had arranged themselves in a wider circle now, creating a protective barrier around the rescue operation. Their attention was divided between their trapped father and the surrounding landscape, watching for other threats while allowing these strange humans to work their incomprehensible magic. "On my count," Django called out, his fingers positioned on his release mechanism while Marcus mirrored his position on the opposite side. "These have to be pressed simultaneously or the fail-safe will lock everything in place permanently. 1, 2. The moment stretched like eternity, filled with the weight of all their individual failures and hopes. Marcus thought of Timothy's drawings, of promises broken and chances missed. Sarah thought of Emma alone in a hospital bed, fighting battles she couldn't win. Django thought of his father's sacrifice, of the endless cycle of protection and loss that defined life in the wild. 3! Both men pressed their release mechanisms simultaneously, and the steel jaws of the trap sprang open with a metallic clang that echoed across the savannah like a bell tolling freedom. The metallic clang of the opening trap echoed across the Serengeti like a gunshot, followed by a moment of profound silence that seemed to stretch beyond the boundaries of time itself. Simba's massive form shuddered as the steel jaws released their cruel grip, dark blood immediately pooling in the red dust beneath his wounded leg. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Not the humans who had orchestrated his freedom, not the lionesses who had maintained their vigil, not even Simba himself, as if the sudden absence of pain was too overwhelming to process. Then, like a dam bursting, everything happened at once. The 5 lionesses surged forward in a coordinated rush that should have terrified the humans, but instead felt like witnessing something sacred. Nala reached her father first, her massive head nuzzling against his mane with a tenderness that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. The other four daughters, Sarabi, Kiara, Vitani, and Zira, pressed close, their rumbling purrs creating a vibration that seemed to resonate through the ground itself. Simba struggled to rise, his wounded leg trembling under his weight. The trap had done significant damage, deep lacerations where the steel had bitten into flesh, probable fractures, and extensive soft tissue trauma that would require immediate medical attention. Yet the lion's eyes remained fixed on Marcus Kane with an expression that defied every scientific explanation Sarah's academic mind tried to construct. "We need to get him to the veterinary station," Django said, but his voice lacked conviction. The nearest facility capable of treating a wounded lion was over 200 miles away, and Simba's condition was deteriorating rapidly. Blood loss, shock, and the onset of infection created a ticking clock that made their earlier race against the trap seem leisurely by comparison. Marcus stood frozen, staring at the freed lion with an expression of such raw anguish that it seemed to physically pain him to breathe. His rifle lay forgotten in the dust, his hands hanging loose at his sides as if he'd forgotten how to use them. "He's going to die anyway," he whispered, his voice breaking. "All I've done is make his suffering last longer." But Simba had other plans. Using a strength that seemed to come from somewhere beyond physical capability, the lion hauled himself to his feet. His wounded leg couldn't bear full weight, forcing him into an awkward three-legged stance, but he was upright. More impossibly, he began moving toward Marcus with deliberate, painful steps. "Don't move," Sarah breathed, her camera forgotten as she watched the massive predator approach the man who had spent months hunting his kind. "Stay perfectly still." The lionesses flanked their father, ready to defend him if the human proved treacherous, but their posture suggested anticipation rather than aggression. This was clearly behavior they'd witnessed before, though in what context, none of the humans could begin to guess. Marcus trembled as 800 pounds of wounded lion stopped just arm's length away. Simba's breathing was labored, his golden coat matted with blood and dust, but his amber eyes remained steady and intelligent. Slowly, with infinite care, the great cat extended his massive head toward Marcus's outstretched hand. The touch, when it came, was gentler than anything Marcus had felt in 3 years. Simba's rough tongue rasped across the scarred knuckles that had held weapons in 3 different wars, had signed Timothy's medical forms, had shaken with withdrawal and grief and rage. The lion's breath was warm against his palm, carrying scents of wildness and freedom that Marcus had forgotten existed. "Jesus Christ," Marcus breathed, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "You remember, don't you? You remember Timothy." Sarah's scientific mind reeled at the implications. Lions weren't supposed to remember individual humans after years of separation, especially not children they'd encountered briefly in controlled environments. Yet Simba's behavior suggested not just recognition, but affection, the kind of gentle interaction reserved for trusted family members. Her phone buzzed insistently, jerking her back to her own crisis. The caller ID showed her mother's care facility, and Sarah's stomach clenched with fresh dread. She answered reluctantly, keeping her voice low to avoid disturbing the extraordinary scene unfolding before her. "Dr. Mitchell, this is Nancy from Sunrise Manor. Your mother had another episode last night." "She's asking for Emma, but of course Emma's—" "Well, we thought you should know that your mother seems to think something terrible has happened. She keeps saying, 'My girls are in trouble,' over and over." Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of impossible choices crushing down on her shoulders. 3,000 miles away, Her sister lay in a hospital bed after attempting suicide, while their mother's deteriorating mind somehow sensed the family's pain across the void of dementia. Here in Africa, she was witnessing behavior that could revolutionize understanding of animal cognition, but what good was scientific breakthrough when her own family was disintegrating? "I'll be home as soon as I can arrange a flight," she said quietly, then ended the call. Marcus had sunk to his knees beside Simba, his hands gently examining the lion's wounds with the practiced competence of someone who'd treated battlefield injuries. "The bleeding's slowing," he reported, his voice thick with emotion, "but he needs antibiotics, proper cleaning, maybe surgery to repair the tendon damage." "The nearest veterinary facility is in Arusha," Jengo said, already calculating logistics. "But we'd never make it in time, not with his condition. He needs treatment here, now." It was then that Marcus made a decision that surprised everyone, himself included. He reached into his pack and withdrew a comprehensive field medical kit, the kind carried by Special Forces medics, equipped with surgical instruments, antibiotics, and emergency supplies that far exceeded standard safari provisions. "I came here to kill him," Marcus said quietly, his hands already working to clean Simba's wounds. "The least I can do is try to save him instead." Jengo watched in amazement as Marcus's military training took over, transforming the broken hunter into a competent field medic. The irony wasn't lost on him. The man who'd traveled thousands of miles to end this lion's life was now fighting just as desperately to preserve it. The Lionesses seemed to understand that this human posed no threat. Nala lay down beside her father, providing support for his wounded side, while the others formed a protective perimeter around the makeshift medical station. Their behavior continued to defy every known pattern of predator conduct, as if grief and love had rewritten the fundamental rules that governed their species. As Marcus worked, cleaning wounds and applying antiseptic with steady hands, he began to speak in a voice so low it was almost a whisper. "Timothy used to talk about you all the time after our zoo visits. He said you were different from the other lions, that you understood things. I thought it was just a kid's imagination, but now—" Sarah documented everything with her camera, but for once, the scientific application seemed secondary to the raw humanity of the moment. This was about more than animal behavior or research grants. This was about broken people finding redemption in the most unlikely circumstances. "There," Marcus said finally, securing the last bandage around Simba's leg. "That should hold until we can get proper veterinary care." He sat back on his heels, exhausted by the emotional toll of the morning's events. Timothy would have loved seeing this. He always said animals were better than people because they forgave easier. Simba's response was to rest his massive head against Marcus's shoulder, a gesture of trust so profound that it left all three humans speechless. The lion's purr rumbled through his chest like distant thunder, and gradually his daughters joined in, creating a symphony of contentment that seemed to heal something fundamental in the African morning. But their moment of peace was shattered by the sound of approaching vehicles, multiple engines moving fast and with obvious hostile intent. Jengo grabbed his radio, his face grim as he recognized the signature of the poaching crews that had plagued the park for months. "We've got company," he said tersely, "and they're not here to help." The sound of automatic weapons being chambered echoed across the savannah, and suddenly their morning of impossible connections and tentative healing was about to become something far more dangerous. The convoy of 3 vehicles crested the hill like harbingers of violence, their engines roaring with the aggressive urgency of men who viewed the African wilderness as nothing more than a commodity to be harvested. Dust clouds billowed behind them as they descended toward the watering hole, automatic weapons glinting in the harsh sunlight. Jengo's blood ran cold as he recognized the lead vehicle, a modified land cruiser that belonged to Viktor Kozlov, a Russian mercenary who'd turned poaching into a military operation. "Get down!" Django shouted, grabbing his rifle as the first vehicle skidded to a halt 50 yards away. "These aren't ordinary poachers. They're paramilitaries, and they shoot first." Marcus's combat instincts kicked in immediately, his body moving with muscle memory honed in Vietnamese jungles decades earlier. He scooped up his rifle and rolled behind a large termite mound, positioning himself to provide covering fire for Sarah and the wounded lion. The lionesses reacted to the sudden tension with predatory alertness, their ears flattened against their skulls as low growls rumbled from their throats. "Sarah, get behind the jeep!" Marcus barked, but the wildlife researcher seemed frozen in place, her camera still recording as armed men poured from the vehicles. Her scientific mind was struggling to process the transformation of their peaceful morning into a war zone, the cognitive dissonance rendering her temporarily immobile. Simba struggled to his feet despite his injuries, instinctively placing himself between his daughters and the approaching threat. The great lion's wounded leg trembled under his weight, but his massive frame radiated defiance even in his weakened state. Behind him, Nal and her sisters arranged themselves in a defensive formation that spoke to millions of years of evolutionary survival programming. Viktor Kozlov emerged from the lead vehicle like a figure from Sarah's worst nightmares about human exploitation of wildlife. The Russian was built like a Soviet-era tank, broad shoulders, bullet-shaped head, and cold gray eyes that assessed everything in terms of profit margins and acceptable losses. His tactical vest bore the scars of multiple conflicts, and the AK-47 in his hands was maintained with the obsessive care of a professional killer. "Well, well," Victor called out in accented English, his voice carrying across the distance with casual menace. "Marcus Kane, the famous American hunter. I heard you were working my territory." Marcus kept his rifle trained on the mercenary leader while scanning for the other gunmen who'd deployed in a tactical spread around their position. "This isn't your territory, Kozlov. These are protected animals in a national park." Victor's laugh was harsh and humorless. "Protected by who? This ranger with his antique rifle? The American woman with her camera?" He gestured dismissively toward Sarah, who was finally moving toward cover behind Django's jeep. "I have contracts to fulfill, Mr. Kane. That lion's mane alone is worth $50,000 to my Chinese buyers." The mercenary's casual mention of profit margins for Simba's body parts hit Marcus like a physical blow. This was what he'd become, a participant in an industry that reduced magnificent creatures to their component parts, that saw lions not as sentient beings but as walking bank accounts. The realization that he'd been no different from these thugs made his stomach churn with self-loathing. "The lion's injured," Django called out, trying to buy time while he radioed for backup that he knew wouldn't arrive in time. "He's no threat to anyone. Just take what you came for and leave." But Victor's attention had shifted to something far more valuable than a single lion. His gray eyes had fixed on Sarah's camera equipment with the focused intensity of a predator recognizing prey. "Dr. Sarah Mitchell," he said slowly, reading her name from research permits visible through her vehicle's windshield. "The famous wildlife researcher. I wonder what the American government would pay for her safe return." The threat was implicit but unmistakable. Sarah felt ice water flooding her veins as she realized that her presence had escalated the situation beyond a simple poaching incident. These men weren't just after lions, they were opportunistic predators who would exploit any weakness, any vulnerability they encountered. Marcus's finger tightened on his rifle trigger as combat calculations flooded his mind. 3 vehicles, at least 8 gunmen, superior firepower, and elevated positions that gave them tactical advantage. The math was brutally simple. He and Django were outgunned and outmanned with no realistic hope of winning a firefight. But retreat wasn't an option with Sarah in danger and Simba unable to flee. "Leave the woman out of this," Marcus said, his voice carrying the flat authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in life-or-death situations. "Your business is with poachers and animals, not civilians." Victor's smile was as cold as Siberian winter. "My business is with whoever brings the best price, Mr. Kane. American researchers disappear in Africa all the time. Tragic accidents, wild animal attacks, equipment failures in remote locations." He paused to let the implications sink in. Unless, of course, someone were willing to make alternative arrangements. The subtext was clear. Victor wanted Marcus to choose between his newfound commitment to protecting Simba and Sarah's safety. It was the kind of impossible decision that had haunted Marcus's nightmares since Timothy's death. The sort of cruel calculation that reduced human morality to its most basic components. But before Marcus could respond, something extraordinary happened. Simba took a painful step forward, placing himself directly between the armed mercenaries and the humans who had freed him from the trap. The lion's massive frame trembled with exhaustion and blood loss, but his amber eyes blazed with fierce determination as he issued a roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. The sound was primordial, reaching back to humanity's earliest memories of sharing the African landscape with apex predators. It spoke of territories defended and families protected, of the ancient covenant between the strong and those they chose to shelter. Victor's gunmen shifted nervously, their weapons suddenly feeling inadequate against forces they couldn't quantify or intimidate. Behind Simba, his 5 daughters responded to their father's challenge with roars of their own, creating a symphony of defiance that made the hair on Sarah's arms stand on end. These weren't the calculated vocalizations of animals responding to threat. This was family standing together against overwhelming odds, choosing courage over survival. "Shoot the lion!" Victor barked, raising his AK-47 toward Simba's massive chest. "Make an example!" But his gunmen hesitated, unnerved by the unprecedented behavior of the pride. Lions weren't supposed to defend humans, weren't supposed to place themselves between armed threats and potential prey. The mercenaries had dealt with wounded animals before, but never ones that seemed to understand the moral dimensions of the conflict unfolding around them. Marcus used their moment of uncertainty to make his move. Rolling from behind the termite mound, he squeezed off 3 rapid shots that sent Victor's men diving for cover behind their vehicles. His marksmanship was still sharp after all these years. One shot shattered a windshield, another punctured a tire, and the third sparked off metal inches from Victor's head. "Sarah, run!" Marcus shouted while working the bolt of his rifle. "Get to the radio and call for help!" But Sarah Mitchell had reached her own breaking point. 3 years of watching her sister's mental health deteriorate, months of failed research, and now the prospect of becoming a bargaining chip in someone else's war had crystallized her rage into something pure and focused. Instead of running, she grabbed Django's spare rifle and positioned herself to provide covering fire. "I'm tired of running," she said through gritted teeth, her academic composure finally cracking to reveal the steel beneath. "I'm tired of being helpless while everyone I care about suffers." The lionesses seemed to sense the shift in their human allies' determination. Nala issued a low, rumbling call that was answered immediately by her sisters, and suddenly the pride was moving with coordinated precision that made Victor's tactical formation look amateurish by comparison. They spread out in a classic hunting pattern, using available cover to approach the mercenaries from multiple angles simultaneously. Victor realized his situation had deteriorated beyond acceptable parameters. What should have been a simple poaching operation had evolved into something resembling a nightmare. Wounded lions that refused to behave like animals, humans who fought like soldiers, and dynamics he couldn't control or predict. "Fall back!" he shouted to his men, but it was already too late. The morning of unexpected alliances and impossible choices was about to reach its violent crescendo. The gunfight erupted with the sudden violence of a thunderstorm, muzzle flashes strobing in the African sunlight as automatic weapons chattered their deadly rhythm across the savannah. Marcus rolled behind a boulder as bullets whined overhead, his military training flooding back with crystal clarity despite the decades that had passed since Vietnam. The sound of combat was a language he understood fluently, even when he desperately wished he'd forgotten how to speak it. Victor's mercenaries had superior firepower, but they'd made a crucial tactical error by underestimating their opponents. The Lionesses moved like ghosts through the scattered rocks and acacia trees, their tawny coats providing perfect camouflage as they flanked the gunmen with predatory precision. These weren't zoo animals or circus performers, they were apex predators who'd evolved to hunt in coordinated groups, and they seemed to understand that these humans represented a threat to their wounded father. "Contact left!" one of the mercenaries screamed as Sarabi materialized from behind a termite mound, her 300 pounds of muscle and claw bearing down on him with terrifying speed. The man's rifle chattered wildly as he backpedaled, his shots going wide as panic overrode his training. The lioness didn't attack. Instead, she seemed content to drive him away from the main fight, herding him like wayward prey toward the periphery of the battlefield. Sarah crouched behind Django's jeep, her hands shaking as she worked the bolt of the unfamiliar rifle. Her academic background hadn't prepared her for combat, but desperation and rage provided motivation that transcended training. Every time she thought of Emma alone in that hospital bed, of their mother's confused pleas for her absent daughters, her grip on the weapon steadied and her aim improved. Marcus had found his rhythm now, his shots precise and economical as he picked targets with the patience of a professional. He wasn't trying to kill, not yet, but each bullet served notice that this wouldn't be the easy harvest Victor had anticipated. A shot through one mercenary's shoulder sent him sprawling behind cover, while another round disabled the engine of their lead vehicle, black smoke billowing across the battlefield like a funeral shroud. "Django!" Marcus called out during a brief lull in the firing. "We need to move Simba. He's too exposed out there." But the wounded lion had his own ideas about positioning. Despite his injuries, Simba had somehow managed to place himself at the center of the combat zone, his massive frame serving as a rallying point for his daughter's coordinated assault. Blood seeped through Marcus's field dressings, but the great cat's amber eyes remained alert and focused, tracking threats with the intelligence of a battlefield commander. Victor emerged from behind his disabled vehicle, his face twisted with fury as he realized his simple poaching operation had devolved into a nightmare of complications. The Russian's cold gray eyes fixed on Simba with murderous intent, his AK-47 swinging toward the wounded lion with mechanical precision. "You want to play hero?" Victor snarled in Marcus's direction. "Watch your new friend die!" The burst of automatic fire that followed was aimed directly at Simba's chest. 30 rounds of high-velocity ammunition that should have ended the magnificent creature's life in a heartbeat. But in that crucial moment, something extraordinary happened that would haunt Marcus's dreams for years to come. Nala, the alpha lioness, who'd shown such gentle trust just minutes earlier, threw herself directly into the path of Victor's gunfire. The bullets meant for her father struck her instead, spinning her massive frame sideways as she collapsed in the red dust. Her sacrifice bought precious seconds, but the cost was devastating. Dark blood pooled beneath her golden coat as she struggled to breathe, her amber eyes already beginning to glaze. "No!" The scream that tore from Sarah's throat was primal, reaching back to humanity's earliest bonds with the natural world. She'd witnessed the lioness's deliberate sacrifice, had seen intelligence and love transcend species boundaries in the most heartbreaking way possible. Without conscious thought, she found herself running toward the wounded lioness, her rifle forgotten as maternal instincts overrode survival considerations. Marcus watched Sarah's desperate charge with horror and admiration in equal measure. The woman who'd spent months observing lions from academic distance was now kneeling beside a dying predator, her hands gentle on the massive head as she whispered words of comfort that transcended language barriers. It was exactly the kind of reckless compassion that had defined Timothy's short life, the sort of pure empathy that made both of them too good for a world this cruel. Victor's follow-up shots were aimed at Sarah's exposed position, but Marcus was already moving. His combat role carried him out of cover and into the open, drawing the Russians' fire away from the kneeling researcher. Bullets sparked off rocks around him as he sprinted toward Victor's position, his own rifle abandoned in favor of the combat knife he'd carried through 3 different wars. The two men collided with bone-jarring impact, rolling across the ground in a tangle of limbs and curses. Victor was younger and heavier, but Marcus fought with the desperate fury of a man who'd already lost everything that mattered. They crashed through scattered equipment and over rough terrain, each seeking the leverage that would end their struggle permanently. "You should have taken my offer," Victor grunted as they grappled for control of the Russian sidearm. "Now everyone dies for nothing." But Marcus was no longer fighting for abstract principles or distant causes. As his hands closed around Victor's throat, he saw Timothy's face in his mind, not the broken child who died because his father couldn't heal from war, but the bright-eyed boy who'd drawn pictures of lions and believed in heroes. He saw Sarah's courage in the face of impossible odds, Django's quiet dedication to protecting creatures that couldn't speak for themselves, and Simba's magnificent defiance despite wounds that should have killed him. "Not for nothing," Marcus rasped, his grip tightening. "For family." The crack of Victor's neck breaking was audible across the battlefield, followed by a silence so profound it seemed to absorb sound itself. The remaining mercenaries, seeing their leader dead and their tactical situation hopeless, began a fighting withdrawal toward their remaining vehicles. Sporadic gunfire continued for several more minutes, but the heart had gone out of their assault. Django emerged from cover, blood streaming from a graze across his forehead, and immediately began coordinating with Marcus to secure the area. But their victory felt hollow as they surveyed the carnage. Nala lay dying in Sarah's arms, her breathing increasingly labored as life ebbed from her magnificent frame. "She saved him," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her dust-stained cheeks. She knew what those bullets would do, and she saved him anyway. Simba had dragged himself to his daughter's side despite his own injuries, his massive head resting against hers as he rumbled a low song of mourning that seemed to encompass all the grief the African wilderness had ever known. The remaining lionesses pressed close, their combined purring creating a vibration that spoke to the fundamental bonds that held families together across species lines. Marcus knelt beside the dying lioness, his weathered hands gentle on her bloodied coat. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice breaking with emotion he'd thought permanently buried. "Thank you for showing me what love looks like." Nala's amber eyes fixed on his face with startling clarity, and for a moment that stretched beyond the boundaries of time, Marcus felt a connection that transcended every barrier between human and animal consciousness. In those dying eyes he saw recognition, forgiveness, and something that looked remarkably like peace. When the lioness finally stopped breathing, the silence that followed was broken only by Simba's roar of grief, a sound so profound and heartbreaking that it seemed to carry across the entire Serengeti, announcing to every creature within miles that something precious had been lost forever. Sarah's satellite phone buzzed with an incoming call from Boston, jerking her back to the crisis she'd temporarily forgotten. The caller ID showed the hospital number, and her hands trembled as she answered. "Dr. Mitchell? This is Dr. Rodriguez from Massachusetts General. Your sister is stable, but she's been asking for you constantly. She keeps saying something about lions and promises. We're not sure what it means, but she seems convinced that you're in danger." The irony wasn't lost on Sarah that Emma's fractured mind had somehow sensed her sister's peril across 8,000 miles of distance. "Tell her I'm safe," Sarah said quietly, watching Marcus and Jengo work together to treat Simba's wounds with newfound urgency. "Tell her the lions are safe too." As the sun reached its zenith over the blood-soaked earth, 3 broken humans and 1 wounded lion began the slow process of healing from trauma that extended far beyond the morning's violence. 6 months after the gunfight that had transformed 3 broken strangers into an unlikely family, the Serengeti looked much the same as it always had, endless golden grasslands stretching toward horizons that seemed to touch eternity itself. But for those who knew where to look, everything had changed. The watering hole where Simba had nearly died now bore a small memorial plaque written in English, Swahili, and Russian, "In memory of Nala, who taught us that love transcends species." Marcus Kane stood beside that memorial as the sun painted the morning sky in shades of amber and gold, his weathered hands holding a letter from his mother that had arrived just yesterday. Mary Kane's handwriting was shakier than it used to be, but her words carried the strength that had sustained their family through decades of hardship. "My dearest Marcus," the letter read, "I've been thinking about Timothy a lot lately, especially after seeing those photographs you sent of the lion sanctuary. I know you blame yourself for what happened to our boy, but I want you to know something that might surprise you. The day before Timothy died, he came to me with one of his lion drawings, the one of the big male with the scar on his face. He said, 'Grandma, when Daddy gets better from the war, I want him to help the lions like this one. They're brave like Daddy, but sometimes they get hurt and need someone to take care of them.' I think our boy knew something we didn't understand at the time. I think he knew you'd find your way to exactly where you needed to be." Marcus folded the letter carefully, his eyes moving to the sprawling complex that had grown around the original watering hole. The Kane Wildlife Preserve now covered nearly 10,000 acres of reclaimed poaching territory, funded by the sale of Victor's abandoned equipment and vehicles, supplemented by ecotourism revenue that had transformed the local economy. What had started as one man's guilt-driven penance had evolved into something far more significant, a model for conservation that proved former enemies could become the most dedicated protectors. Simba emerged from the shade of a massive baobab tree, his limp barely noticeable now after months of careful rehabilitation. The great lion's mane had grown back fuller than before, and his amber eyes held a depth of intelligence that continued to astound visiting researchers. He approached Marcus with the confident stride of an animal who understood his place in this new world, not as a captive or a curiosity, but as a partner in something larger than any individual life. "Morning, old friend," Marcus said quietly, his hand resting on Simba's massive head with the casual familiarity of long friendship. "Sarah's flight should be landing in Arusha about now. Think she'll be surprised by how much Emma has improved?" As if in response to his name, a young woman's voice called out from the direction of the main compound. "Marcus, is that Sarah's Jeep on the horizon?" Emma Mitchell had arrived in Tanzania 3 months earlier, ostensibly for a short visit to see the sanctuary her sister had helped establish. But the 25-year-old woman who'd attempted suicide in a Boston hospital had found something in the African wilderness that no amount of therapy or medication had been able to provide, a sense of purpose that transcended her neurological differences. Her autism, which had been a source of isolation and frustration in urban America, proved to be an unexpected gift when it came to understanding animal behavior. Emma could read the subtle communication patterns between lions with an accuracy that amazed professional ethologists, and her presence had a calming effect on traumatized animals that defied scientific explanation. Marcus waved toward the approaching dust cloud that marked Sarah's return from her latest fundraising trip to the United States. "That's her," he confirmed, watching Emma's face light up with the unguarded joy that had become her trademark since arriving in Africa. "And yes, I think she's going to be amazed by how well you've been doing." The transformation in Emma Mitchell was nothing short of miraculous. The pale, withdrawn young woman who'd been hospitalized for severe depression had been replaced by someone who radiated confidence and purpose. Her work with the sanctuary's rescued lions had given her a voice she'd never found in human society, and her detailed behavioral observations had already contributed to 2 published papers in leading conservation journals. But perhaps the most remarkable change was in her relationship with her sister. For the first time in their lives, Emma was the one providing care and guidance rather than receiving it, and the role reversal had been healing for both women in ways that neither had anticipated. Jengo Mwangi appeared from the direction of the veterinary clinic, his ranger's uniform now bearing the insignia of the sanctuary's head of security. His daughter Amara had started her first year at the University of Dar es Salaam, studying wildlife management with a full scholarship funded by the preserve's educational program. The pride in Jengo's eyes when he spoke of her academic achievements was matched only by his satisfaction at seeing his father's dream of peaceful coexistence between humans and lions finally becoming reality. "The new arrivals from the Ngorongoro rescue are settling in well," Jengo reported, his weathered face creased with satisfaction. 3 cubs and their mother, all responding positively to the rehabilitation protocol Emma designed. Marcus nodded, still amazed by the systematic approach Emma had developed for integrating traumatized lions into the preserve's social structure. Her autism-driven attention to detail and pattern recognition had revolutionized their understanding of how captive lions could be successfully returned to semi-wild conditions. Sarah's Jeep pulled up to the memorial site in a cloud of red dust, and the woman who emerged looked nothing like the desperate researcher who'd arrived in Africa 18 months earlier. Dr. Sarah Mitchell had found her place in the world, splitting her time between the sanctuary and lecture circuits in America and Europe, where her footage of the morning that changed everything had become a powerful tool for conservation fundraising. But it was her relationship with her sister that represented the most profound transformation. Where once there had been guilt and obligation, now there was partnership and mutual respect. Emma had finally found an environment where her neurological differences were assets rather than disabilities, while Sarah had learned that love sometimes meant letting go of the need to fix everything. "Emma," Sarah called out, her face radiant with the joy of reunion, "I have so much to tell you about the Cambridge presentation. The Neurological Research Department wants to fund a study on autism and animal communication patterns." The sisters embraced with the easy affection of people who'd survived the worst together and emerged stronger. But Emma's attention was quickly drawn to a small bundle Sarah was carefully lifting from the passenger seat of her Jeep. "Please tell me that's what I think it is," Emma said breathlessly, her hands clasped together with excitement. Sarah grinned and pulled back a soft blanket to reveal a 3-month-old lion cub, orphaned when his mother had been killed by poachers in Kenya. "Meet Timothy," she said quietly, glancing at Marcus with eyes that held years of shared understanding. "The Kenyan authorities asked specifically if we could take him, given our success rate with traumatized cubs." Marcus felt his breath catch as he looked at the tiny creature who bore his son's name. The cub's amber eyes were bright with curiosity rather than fear, and when Emma reached out to gently stroke his head, he responded with a purr that seemed disproportionately loud for such a small body. "He's perfect," Emma whispered, her voice filled with the wonder that had become her constant companion since arriving at the sanctuary. "Simba's going to love having a son to mentor." The great lion had indeed taken on a paternal role with the preserve's rescued cubs, his patient guidance helping dozens of traumatized youngsters learn to trust humans again. It was as if he understood that his survival had been purchased with Nala's sacrifice, and he was determined to honor her memory by protecting every vulnerable creature that found refuge within the sanctuary's boundaries. As if summoned by the mention of his name, Simba approached the group with the measured dignity that had become his trademark. The cub, Timothy, showed no fear, reaching out with tiny paws toward the massive lion who lowered his great head to sniff the newcomer with gentle curiosity. "Look at that," Django said softly, his voice filled with awe despite having witnessed countless such introductions. "It's like he knows this one is special." Marcus watched the interaction with emotions too complex for words. The circle that had begun with Timothy's death and his own consuming guilt was finally closing in a way that brought healing rather than pain. This sanctuary, built from the wreckage of multiple broken lives, had become something none of them could have imagined. A place where love transcended species boundaries and where second chances were not just possible, but inevitable. Sarah's satellite phone buzzed with a familiar ringtone, their mother's care facility. But instead of dread, Sarah's face showed only warm anticipation as she answered. "Hi, Mom. Yes, it's Sarah. Emma's here with me, and we're both safe." She paused, listening to their mother's voice across the miles. "You want to know about the lions? Well, we have a new baby lion named Timothy, and he's absolutely beautiful. Emma's going to help take care of him." The conversation continued for several minutes, their mother's dementia-clouded mind somehow finding clarity when focused on her daughter's work with the animals. And it was one of the small miracles that had become commonplace at the preserve, the healing power of purpose and connection that seemed to transcend every barrier that typically separated individuals. As the sun climbed higher into the endless African sky, the unlikely family that had been forged in violence and loss gathered around the memorial to the lioness who'd made it all possible. Simba settled beside Marcus with the contentment of a creature who understood he was exactly where he belonged, while the cub Timothy played between Emma's gentle hands. "You know what Timothy used to say?" Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying across the golden grassland like a prayer. "He said families weren't just the people you were born with, but the ones who chose to love you even when it was hard." Sarah reached for her sister's hand while Emma continued to marvel at the tiny lion who would grow up surrounded by the kind of love that had saved them all. Django stood at respectful distance, his own heart full with the knowledge that his father's dream of harmony between humans and lions had finally found expression in this sacred place. In the distance, the 4 remaining lionesses who'd survived that terrible morning were teaching their own cubs the complex lessons of survival and family. The preserve now housed 43 lions, ranging from elderly survivors of poaching attempts to newborns who would never know fear of human cruelty. But perhaps the most important lesson being learned within the sanctuary's boundaries was one that couldn't be taught in any classroom or captured in any research paper. Love, they'd discovered, was not a finite resource that diminished when shared, but something that grew stronger with each connection made across the seemingly impossible barriers that separated one heart from another. As Marcus Kane stood beside the memorial to a lioness who'd died saving her father, surrounded by the family he'd never expected to find, he finally understood what his son had been trying to tell him all those years ago. Heroes weren't the ones who won battles or conquered enemies. They were the ones who chose love over fear, connection over isolation, and hope over despair, even when the cost seemed too high to bear. The morning sun climbed higher into the endless African sky, painting the Serengeti in shades of gold that spoke to the eternal possibility of redemption. And in that light, three broken humans, one wounded lion, and a tiny cub named Timothy, began another day of building something beautiful from the ashes of everything they'd lost. Sometimes the greatest journeys begin with the deepest pain. Marcus Kane thought he'd lost everything that mattered: his son Timothy, his purpose, his faith in goodness. Like many of us who've reached this stage of life, he carried wounds that seemed too deep to heal. But in the golden grasslands of Africa, surrounded by creatures who understood loss as deeply as he did, Marcus discovered something profound. Family isn't just blood. It's the people who choose to love you through your darkest moments. When Simba the lion was trapped and dying, Marcus faced a choice that would define the rest of his life. He could remain trapped by his own pain, or he could break free by helping another soul in need. What he found was that healing comes not from forgetting our losses, but from transforming them into love for others. The sanctuary Marcus built became a haven for broken creatures, both human and animal, proving that it's never too late for second chances. Whether you're 55 or 75, whether you're caring for aging parents or watching grandchildren grow, remember this: your story isn't over. Your greatest chapter of love, purpose, and connection might be just beginning. What loss in your life might actually be preparing you for your greatest purpose? Have you ever experienced an unexpected friendship that changed everything? Share your story below. We'd love to hear how life surprised you with healing when you least expected it.